Sometime around the early 1800s, a civilization that had existed for centuries was quietly erased from the record books. The cities were still standing, the canals were still full, the buildings were still warm, but the people who had built all of it were gone, and in their place a new class of owners arrived with documents, deeds, and a story about how none of it had ever belonged to anyone else. This is not the history you were taught. It is the history that was scrubbed, reclassified, and buried under a century of deliberate misdirection. Tonight, we pull it back up. If you've never heard of Tartaria, or if you have heard of it and been told to dismiss it, stay with this. Because the question isn't whether a great civilization existed before the official historical record begins. The question is who benefited from making sure you never found out. Subscribe if you want the full picture. This channel exists to show you the things that don't make it into textbooks. For centuries, maps of the known world included a vast empire stretching from Eastern Europe all the way across the Asian continent, reaching into what we now call Siberia, China, and even parts of the American Northwest. It appeared on maps produced by some of the most respected cartographers in European history: Blaeu, Mercator, or Tellius. Men whose work was treated as gospel by navigators, merchants, and kings. They called it Tartaria. On Blaeu's world map from 1635, Tartaria is not a footnote. It is the single largest political entity on Earth, dwarfing every European nation, the way the ocean dwarfs a harbour. It stretches across millions of square miles, labelled clearly, divided into regions, annotated with cities and rivers and mountain ranges. This is not fringe cartography. This is the mainstream academic consensus of the 17th century. And then it disappeared. Not slowly, not through the gradual revision of boundaries as empires rise and fall. It disappeared the way a name disappears when someone wants to make sure you forget it was ever there. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria as a geopolitical entity had been almost entirely removed from Western maps. The land it once occupied had been divided up, renamed, reassigned to other nations, and the populations described in those earlier accounts had been reclassified as primitive nomadic peoples with no lasting civilization worth documenting. The question that historians have never satisfactorily answered is simple. Where did everyone go? The Tartarian population, by the estimates embedded in those same 17th century documents, numbered in the hundreds of millions. They occupied cities. They built infrastructure. They had trade routes, religious institutions, courts of law, and artistic traditions so sophisticated that European travellers in the 1600s wrote home about them with barely concealed envy. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Then they vanish from the record. Not in the way that the Roman Empire vanished, leaving behind ruins so spectacular they became tourist destinations for the next 2,000 years. The Tartarian civilization vanished in a way that is almost more unsettling. It left behind buildings that nobody can fully explain, infrastructure that no official historical narrative bothers to account for, and a paper trail of deliberate erasure so consistent that it begins to look less like history and more like housekeeping. To understand what happened, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1800. The French Revolution had just dismantled one of the oldest monarchies in the world. Napoleon was preparing to redraw the map of Europe by force. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty was tightening its grip on territories that had previously been governed under entirely different systems. The people who held political power in 1800 were people who had recently acquired it, and they had a significant interest in making sure that nobody looked too carefully at who had held it before. This is where the mud flood theory enters the picture, and whatever you've been told to think about it, it is worth examining on its own merits. The mud flood hypothesis proposes that sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century, A catastrophic event covered large portions of the northern hemisphere in a thick layer of sediment. The evidence cited includes the extraordinary number of old buildings across Europe, Russia, and North America whose ground floors are partially or entirely buried, first floor windows that are now below street level, doors that open onto walls of earth, entire neighborhoods where the street level has clearly risen by several meters, not over millennia but within what the architectural record suggests was a very short period. Walk through the old cities of St. Petersburg and you will find this phenomenon repeatedly. Buildings whose design clearly indicates that the ground floor was the main entrance, now accessible only through what used to be the second story. Basements laid out with the architectural logic of primary living spaces. Windows positioned too close to the current ground to have ever been intended as basement windows. The same pattern appears in Vienna, in Paris, in Chicago, in hundreds of smaller cities across the American Midwest whose official histories describe them as having been built from scratch in the mid-1800s, yet whose oldest structures show signs of being partially excavated rather than newly constructed. The standard explanation is that street levels were simply raised over time through accumulated debris and fill material. That explanation works in some cases. It does not work in all of them, and the cases where it fails tend to be in locations that had the most to lose from a coherent Tartarian history. If a catastrophic event did occur in the late 1700s or early 1800s, it would explain with remarkable precision the timing of something else that happened during that same window, the sudden wholesale repopulation of the land. Look at the foundation documents of dozens of American cities. Look at the land grants issued in Russia after the Napoleonic Wars. Look at the property records of major European urban centres in the years between 1800 and 1850. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. What you find consistently is a sudden surge of new ownership, new names on old deeds, new institutions established in buildings whose construction dates are listed as unknown or estimated. New civic organizations claiming authority over infrastructure that nobody officially built. Someone was paid to begin again. That is the phrase that keeps appearing in the research of those who have spent years on this question. The people who arrived after the reset did not conquer empty land. They were granted it. There is a difference. Conquest requires armies and campaigns, and the kind of historical documentation that wars always generate. What happened in the early 1800s left almost no documentary evidence of conflict. It left documentary evidence of administration, new governors, new surveyors, new courts, the machinery of civilization inherited wholesale, with new nameplates on the doors. Researchers in this space point to a specific category of architecture as their most compelling evidence. Buildings that official history describes as having been constructed by recently arrived settlers in frontier territories with primitive tools and limited resources, yet which display levels of technical sophistication that would challenge professional architects working with modern equipment today. The old courthouses of the American Midwest, the train stations of Eastern Europe, the municipal halls that appear in photographs from the 1860s and 1870s, looking not like newly constructed buildings but like monuments that have been recently cleaned up. The argument is not that these buildings are fakes. The argument is that they are real and that the people who officially built them did not actually build them. They inherited them. And they needed a story to explain how a civilization that had just emerged from the wilderness managed to produce buildings that looked like the products of 1,000 years of institutional knowledge. The story they settled on was the World's Fairs. From 1851 to the early 1900s, a series of international exhibitions were staged in major cities around the world. The Crystal Palace in London, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. officially presented as celebrations of industrial progress. They were also, according to researchers in this space, the mechanism through which a generation of new administrators explained the architectural inheritance they had received. The buildings were described as temporary, built specifically for the event and demolished afterward. This framing was then applied retroactively to any old and inexplicable structure whose existence was otherwise difficult to account for. The logic runs like this. If you were a new administration granted control of a civilization you did not build, you have a problem. The buildings around you are too good, too old-looking. They tell a story that contradicts your origin myth, so you explain them away, you call them fairs, you call them exhibitions, you say they were always temporary, and then you quietly integrate them into your permanent infrastructure while the generation that might remember otherwise grows old and dies. The photography record from this period is complicated. The images from the World's Fair show enormous, elaborate buildings filled with visitors, but almost none show the debris you would expect from demolishing thousands of tons of stone and iron. The before and after photographs that do exist show landscapes that look less like demolition zones and more like cleared lots where something was removed rather than destroyed, which brings us back to the money. If the Tartarian civilization was destroyed or depopulated or absorbed into a new administrative order, then somebody inherited its wealth, not just its buildings, its gold reserves, its trade routes, its institutional knowledge, its astronomical and engineering expertise, which is evident in the architecture and which nobody has ever satisfactorily explained as the product of the pioneer cultures that official history credits with producing it. The families that emerged as the dominant financial powers in Europe and North America in the 19th century did so with startling speed. The Rothschilds had been relatively modest banking practitioners in Frankfurt before the Napoleonic Wars. Within 20 years of that conflict's conclusion, they controlled the central banking systems of 5 countries. The Astors arrived in America with almost nothing and within a generation owned more Manhattan real estate than any other private entity on the continent. The Hudson's Bay Company, originally chartered as a trading organization, administered what amounted to a sovereign government over territories larger than most European nations. These are not coincidences, they are patterns. And the pattern taken together looks less like the normal operation of capitalism and more like the organized distribution of assets that had previously belonged to someone else. There is a specific document category that researchers in this area return to again and again: the foundling home records. Between roughly 1790 and 1860, there was a massive and largely unexplained spike in the population of orphanages and foundling institutions across Europe and North America. These institutions were filling faster than any natural demographic explanation can account for. The children in them had, in many documented cases, no surviving relatives that anyone had bothered to look for. They were processed, educated in the new administrative language of their host country, assigned new names, and released into a society that had no record of where they had come from. This is the part of the Tartarian reset hypothesis that is most difficult to dismiss, because it is drawn from official records. The foundling home documentation is not conspiracy literature. It is archived census data. What that data shows is a generation of children, in numbers that suggest an event of enormous scale, absorbed into the new civilization, with their origins carefully unrecorded. The question of who was paid to begin again is ultimately a question about access to resources that did not previously exist in the possession of those who came to hold them. It is a question about how a handful of banking families and government institutions went from modest origins to global dominance in roughly 50 years, in a world where global dominance had previously required centuries of patient accumulation. The answer that official history provides is genius, industry, and the natural workings of free markets. The answer that the architectural record, the cartographic record, the foundling home records, and the pattern of land ownership suggest is something considerably more direct. Someone cleared the slate, someone absorbed the assets, Someone was handed a civilization and told to put their name on it. And the people who had built every building you cannot explain, who had mapped every territory that cartographers 100 years earlier treated as well-documented fact, who had populated a continent-spanning empire that appeared on the most respected maps in European history, those people were written out of the record with an efficiency that tells you everything you need to know about how deliberate the erasure was. Civilizations do not disappear from the historical record by accident. They disappear when the people who come after them need the record cleared. The Great Reset of 1800 was not a flood. It was not a plague. It was not a war, at least not a war that anyone was allowed to document. It was an administrative event, a transfer of assets, a rewriting of deeds, and the civilization it erased was so vast, so accomplished, and so thoroughly removed from the historical record that most people hearing this for the first time will spend the next several hours going back through what they thought they knew and finding the holes. Go find the holes. The maps are still there if you know where to look. The buildings are still standing if you know what you're looking at. The foundling records are still in the archives. The cartographic consensus of the 17th century has not been destroyed. It has just been made inconvenient. And inconvenient is not the same as gone. If this opens something up for you, the next video is already on screen. We go deeper into the architectural evidence, the specific buildings that no pioneer society could have produced, and the photographs that the official record has never found a satisfying way to explain. Click it now.